I hear you complaining about this particular movie. Why don't you make your own movies? Because then you can do it exactly the way you want to do it.
You are making me really angry now, because I want to tell you in simple chapter and verse that I have tried to get on before the American public, before the world, a movie about the American Indians and the manner in which we committed as a country genocide upon those people. And I have been told to go take a flying, you-know-what, at a rolling donut.
Is that true?
That's absolutely true. For 10 years I've tried to do it. I've written so many scripts. I have gone with so many networks and to so many movie studios with this tale. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear that America followed a policy of genocide. General Grant, one of our great heroes in America, called for the destruction, the annihilation of these people.
You said that in the last 9 years you've been searching for what you really want to do.
Yeah.
Have you decided?
Have you?
Did you ever want to start a national theater or something like that?
We have no basis for culture in this country.
Why do you say that?
Well, there's almost no culture any place in the world. Who are the present great artists, painters, thinkers, philosophers? Where are they? Do you realize that in Greece for 150 years we had Sophocles, Plato, why go down the list?
But I mean, couldn't you bring it to the American stage?
That's an enormous presumption. I mean, if people throw the word artist around as though it were a football.
I didn't accuse you of being an artist. I just asked you if you could bring Shakespeare to the stage for us.
Why has there never been a national theater in this country? The closest we had to the national theater was Orson Welles and John Houseman and the group theater. And they all failed miserably.
So this is part 2. I'm calling this Marlon Brando the greatest because I think he's the greatest, and I think my cohort here, David Wills, probably thinks the same.
I agree.
Yes, I don't think he had the greatest career. We did this top 10 in part 1, so I feel like we've more or less covered his acting career at least. Do you think in a parallel universe he could have had a better career, or is it one of those cases where you don't get the magic without everything else?
I think that's it. Yeah. I mean, there's too many idiosyncrasies to put him on a path where he would have, like, I don't even know who you could compare him. I guess you could compare him to somebody like De Niro in that sense, because De Niro has had a better career, right? You just can't imagine Brando being that disciplined.
It's weird with De Niro because, I mean, if you look at his filmography, I mean, what's he been doing for the last 20 years? He made a couple of good films and making just these horrendous, terrible films, one after another.
I guess he does have that in common with Brando.
Yeah, in a funny way, thinking about it, it's not that similar, although obviously he tends to star in all of his films, so he's obviously a bit of a workaholic. But I think his early career up to a certain point, up to Goodfellas, Cape Fear, I mean, Silver Linings Playbook was all right. Meet the Parents is obviously all right. It's a good comedy, but it's not substantial,
Well, there was no need for any sequels.
Yeah. Oh, no, I actually liked the sequel because then you get, I think Dustin Hoffman and Barbra Streisand were amazing. So but then the one after that, I only got through about 10 minutes.
I don't even know. I
Horrendous.
They made more of them.
Yeah, they made one called Little Fuckers.
Didn't he do Bullwinkle? He did made a Bullwinkle movie. Yeah.
I mean, he's made, I haven't seen them all, but he's made a series of just horrendous films. And then, of course, he finally got together with Pacino. I mean, they had that great scene in Heat. There was one they made before The Irishman with their two cops. And The Irishman, I just, sorry if it's a cliche, that's just 20 years too late,
Yeah.
They should have done that 20 years ago, when they were still sort of mature and aging, but not geriatric. Okay, let's start hitting these bullet points.
All right. What you got?
All right. So I just read Songs My Mother Taught Me, which is his, I'm going to say memoir. We can argue that, I suppose, but I first read it actually when I first went to London. I know exactly when I read it. It's 2001, so that's 20 years ago. Perhaps we could touch on that. And then you recently saw Listen to Me, Marlon, a fantastic documentary. So let's talk about those. So Songs My Mother Taught Me. When was the last time you read that? And I mean, we can't go through the whole thing because we'll be here for the rest, for the rest of the year. But what leaps out when you think about that book, let's say?
Apart from, I recently thumbed through it for this discussion, which it brought me back to when I read it. I mean, I read it when it first came out. I bought it right when it was new. I read it then, and I remember other people that I knew, people at work who were reading it, because at the time it was such a unexpected, autobiography. You just couldn't imagine that this book would have come out. I've since learned, and I don't know if it's true, that Brando knew about the other book coming out, the 1,000-page
piece of Mansa.
Yes, and this was sort of his answer to it, or to beat it in stores by releasing his book. What I remember basically was learning about his childhood, because I really didn't know anything about it. I mean, I guess it all kind of makes sense when you read about, going off to the military academy, his issues with his father, and of course his mother being a drunk. And we mentioned that earlier in one of our top 10 lists, and I should have mentioned it then, Brando's relationship with his mother, because he worshipped his mother in a way that he didn't his father. Because his independent film company he created was called Pennebreaker, right? Well, that was maiden name. So there's something to that. But I thought the stuff about, his father was interesting. It's not too far off from East of Eden, ironically. But that's really what sticks out to me. You've read it more recently.
I mean, just on the childhood, I was just moved in the first 5 pages. These descriptions, there's so many things that I identified with, even though my life has been nothing like Marlon Brando's life. There is a weird familial parallel, and by kind permission of my father, he did say I could mention this. My dad had a somewhat domineering father, my grandfather in Italy, and I don't really want to go into too many details, but he had a profound effect on my dad's life for the wrong reasons. And weirdly enough, my dad was also a pacifist, as Brando clearly was, my dad was sent off to military academy just on a whim of his father. And in fact, my dad, they were learning to ride horses. And my dad said some of the instructors were like truly sadistic. And my dad ended up on this wild horse, a bit like Brando had some interesting encounters with horses as well. And my dad was actually thrown by this horse, and he's still got this huge scar on his arm. But anyway, that was an interesting parallel. But the other thing is that my dad brought out a memoir a few years ago, and my dad describes nature in a very similar way to Brando, because my dad kind of grew up in the countryside. And Brando has these wonderful descriptions. And he talks about how even now as an old man, as he was, I guess he was 70 when that came out, he talks about, these smells.
Right.
He can still smell them now. And I'm kind of like that as well. There's little bits of my childhood. I'm sure you're the same. You still remember them. And it's weird that I meditate. I don't meditate now in a disciplined way, but I did for a while. And when you're meditating and you actually clear your mind, some weird stuff comes up. And it's weird. I could actually smell. This is not possible. You can't smell a smell that's not there. But in my mind, I could smell the disinfectant from my primary school. It was so bizarre. And when I went back to my primary school a few years ago, they were using the same disinfectant. And I'm sure it smells the same as any, but it's just so evocative. And one of the things in his book, he's able to just nail those things, those bits of our childhood that never leave us, that they're always going to be there. Let's talk about Ermi, the governess.
Oh, yes.
This is astonishing. What do you remember about that?
Well, I remember it, more recently. I was reminded of it because it's in the Listen to Me, Marlon documentary, where I don't even know if the recordings that are being played were recordings that were made for the book, because I think that's how the book came together. He was basically just reminiscing into a tape recorder.
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's certainly an unusual relationship, and it sort of set him on the path. Oh, I mean, I guess you can get into the psychology behind that, what he was going to be attracted to later in life.
Yeah. I mean, from what I read just recently, I mean, he's what was he, 4, 5, 6 years old? She was about 17 or something, and they were naked in bed together, essentially almost making out, but not really. But they were rubbing bodies against each other. And I think, again, this is, call it coffee table psychology, but I think maybe that's one of the reasons he was so sexual as well.
Oh yes,
I know when you're a movie star, it's a whole different story. You probably have this inner horn that you wouldn't have known about perhaps if women weren't so available. But I feel like that because I had a friend actually when I was in Thailand. I had a friend who was a really good friend of mine, and he was just so horny like all the time. Sometimes I was just like, oh, can you just calm down a bit,
Right.
And it turned out that when he was a kid, his parents were into what do you call it? Naturalism? What do you call that? Like
nudist
colonies and things.
Yep.
So he was being taken. He wasn't saying anything happened there with him, but
right.
He was seeing naked bodies, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons why Brando seemed to be so sexually charged all the time. And then, like you said, I think wasn't she Swedish? But was it part Indonesian? I think
some sort of a mix. Yeah.
No, again, it seems so obvious, but I think it's true. He said he was always attracted to quote unquote exotic women or dark-skinned women. It's not a coincidence, is it?
No, of course
it seemed like it. Yeah. And I should just clear up because I was talking about my dad's dad. So my dad, he had a profound effect on him. But let me make it clear, my grandfather was not a philanderer, a drunk. And my dad's mother wasn't a drunk either. Absolutely 100% not. So the point I'm making is that Brando had all the trauma of the father plus all this other stuff. So again, it's not to forgive people. It's like if you take anyone who, say, commits a horrendous crime, then almost certainly you'll find something in their childhood where they've suffered a lot.
Right.
You've got to have a justice system. You can't just say, oh, it's because of my childhood. Oh, okay, you can go free, So it's not to forgive Brando, but does his later behavior seem to make sense in a weird way?
Yes, I think it does.
Right,
I mean, we're all products of our childhood. We're all products of our upbringing and whatever our parents did to us, intentionally or otherwise, right?
Yeah, right.
There's really nothing we can do about it. I mean, it's the one area where there's shared responsibility.
Mm.
Yes, you do become responsible for your own actions, of course, but something has to make that foundation, and it's more than just you. His later behavior, I mean, I don't, did you want to talk about that? Meet Marlon Brando? Did you want to segue into talking about that?
Well, just do a little bit more.
You were talking about being sexual, and I was just thinking about all those women being interviewed. They were coming to interview him, and he couldn't resist flirting with all of them.
We'll just carry on with the book, and then, we'll segue to that, and then listen to me, Marlon, because I think those three, in a funny way, Brando 101, let's call it, would be those three. Just carry on with the book for a while.
You know what I can tell you about when that book was released? It was not received well by people that I thought would have enjoyed the book.
Right.
I remember liking it, and there was, I think some people read the book and came away thinking, oh, he's so full of himself, or he's not talking about things that matter the way he should. There's not as much about his film work, which I don't think is true, actually. I was surprised there was as much about acting in the book as there was.
Yeah, there was.
Considering he was so reluctant in other interviews to even discuss it. Even when he was promoting the book, he was reluctant to discuss even the book that he was supposed to be promoting. I always remember, and I told you this off air, I always remember his comment about Elvis. And I was like, oh, no, not you too, Marlon. You got suckered into that. Yeah.
Oh, the cultural appropriation.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I know where it's coming from him, considering his history. And I guess we can delve into that too, because I know that he had felt, and this was also made a point in the book that I'm currently reading with the worst title anyone could ever have for a book, called Brando's Smile. But he did say in some interview that he felt he had a responsibility to be in projects that promoted his concerns globally. So he was led to be in a movie like Burn, for example. And he was saying this about The Ugly American, which is a movie we didn't mention on any of our lists. Even Sayonara, to a point.
Dry White Season as well, later on.
Right. And in this particular book, Brando's Smile, which is mainly about his reading habits and his book collection and notes he would make in the margin. So it's not necessarily like a life story. But it does go into, if he was interested in the subject, like, say, the mistreatment of Native Americans, which you'd have to be a moron not to be sympathetic toward. His library on that topic alone was pretty substantial, and even if when he was doing Sayonara, we might think today that film is kind of a fluffy romance. It doesn't have the impact today that it would have had then, because then it was sort of a plea for tolerance toward interracial marriage is really what that film was going for. And in his library, he'd had so many books on Japanese culture, and he was making notes in the margins, and that it affected the script. So tying that back to Songs My Mother Taught Me, because he does mention that, he explains in the book, for example, the Sachin Littlefeather episode.
The Oscars.
With with the Oscars. So in that book, I think there's, if I remember it correctly, and again, you could tell me better because you read it more recently again, doesn't he give equal time to his acting career and then his concerns outside of acting?
Yeah, there's one, the chapters are generally short. From memory, there's 2 long chapters in a row. I mean, he talks about, the wounded knee. Right. Although he goes to the reservations. And I mean, if you go by his account, he's genuinely quite in fear of his life. They're being shot at. And he talks a lot about civil rights. He nearly made a film about the United Nations, actually. Because funnily enough, he went to India, was it early 60s? And he made these amazing videos of abject poverty and what was really going on. Right. And it's funny to think that even Marlon Brando at that time was fairly naive and thought that if he gave this to the authorities, they'd go, wow, we need to change our whole view of poverty. Let's distribute this all around the world. Of course, they just weren't interested because, unfortunately, it's something that Brando figured out, and I think we figured out as well. And John Lennon, I'm sure, as well. This kind of thing that certain powers that be or the powers that shouldn't be are not really interested in changing the world in that sense. There's a lot about that. I think I had such a personal relationship to this book that I either didn't read the reviews, or when they came out, I was kind of the mind, you just don't get it, Right. You haven't got what's between me and Marlon, I'm like a starstruck fan, but so much of it just resonated with me. And the things that he was expressing, about power and about, what's the truth of the world and what's the truth about people. It's just,
yeah, some of it does seem like, I do remember certainly the early sections of the book almost reading like the Paul speech from Last Tango in Paris, some of what he was writing there. Around that same time, there was another book that I enjoyed called, it was Conversations with Brando, by a writer named Lawrence J. Grobel, I think his name was. And it was actually a 1979 Playboy interview that was expanded to book form. I guess they only used so much. And I'm just impressed with Orson Welles is the same way. Keep bringing him up. There are just some people that, for lack of a better phrase, just have the gift of gab. And they can be just so insightful with their comments. Yeah. And I mean, I'm not going to say that I don't like to use the word genius all that often, but with Brando, it just seems to me, based on his interviews and everything we know about him, hearing his own words, and listen to me, Marlon, that wonderful documentary, what he's writing about in the book. And you could say this about him. You could say it about Orson. You could say it about Dylan. Sure. Something that makes these people special beyond their gifts, which are already enormous, that would be enough, is that they have an insight into the human condition.
I think it's that,
Yeah. What's the word I'm looking for? It's like when they say it, when they're explaining it or they're giving their observations, it seems so utterly simple and true. And it's like, why aren't we all thinking like this?
Exactly, yeah.
It's so logical, and it's just so perfectly put. And, there are a few people, and I'm not one of these people who's worshiping someone else or anything like that, or I think I'm lowly or some, but there are these handful of people that come along who they're just tapped into that, they're tapped into the source. And yeah, it's
a sort of wisdom. Yeah, I'd say rather than genius, because that's a tainted word. When Dan Richter was on my John Lennon podcast, the phrase he came up with was another species, because he said Stanley Kubrick was like that. And you know what it is? I think there may be a practical thing. All those people that you're talking about, I'll bet they were all massive readers I know you don't quite feel the same about John Lennon as I do, but he always had his nose in a book. I don't know about Orson, but Brando is a massive reader. Frank Zappa is another one. If you listen to some of the comments Frank Zappa made, he's really tapped in. And it's interesting that what's called the alternative media that I've been some part of in the last 15 years, mostly in the wake of 9/11, and it's got tagged with this sort of conspiracy movement. But it's not only that. It's stuff like just about power, really, and about how power really works and how there's certain things that you can learn from these people, Dylan, Zappa, Lennon, Brando.
Well, Brando's totally preoccupied with that. I mean, you could almost say he's the, he's laying the ground, the Godfather.
The Godfather of the alternative movement.
Yeah, he really is.
Sure. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just something they've tapped into, and I've benefited greatly from that. Although it can be to your detriment, because if you see through all the bullshit too much, you can struggle to wake up in the morning.
Right. Yeah, then you get consumed with hopelessness. Yes.
Yeah, you can get like nihilistic, I think. Let's talk about, there was one other thing in the book. Yeah, when he describes Tetiaroa, he bought this island in 66.
Right.
There's loads of really good passages about him looking up at the stars and musing about how people hundreds of years ago would have been looking at exactly the same stars. And he's got that sense of history. And again, I kind of developed that as well. A lot of it's through meditation. A lot of meditations they'll talk about, the spirits of billions and billions of humans and how we're all connected and all that kind of thing. And I'm well on board with that. He describes a night just after he bought Tetiaroa. It must have been the 60s. I think he was like lying on the sand, or he's lying on whatever he was lying on, looking at the stars. And he said he had such a peaceful moment that, if you think about all the turbulent things that happened to him for the rest of his life, nothing can take away that peaceful moment. And I had something similar, when I used to live in Thailand, I used to go, when I needed a break from work and everything, I'd go off to an island for 2 or 3 days, just generally by myself or with a couple of other people. And I'd do the same, just gaze at the stars, and just those moments are just fantastic. And the way he describes Tahiti, and, he talks about the sunsets and how, they're all just every shade of pink and every shade of green and blue you can imagine. It's just, magical. Of course, he doesn't talk about, he talks about hundreds and hundreds of assignations with women, but he doesn't mention any of his wives by name.
Right.
Or indeed any of his children. Now, I'm not surprised he didn't talk about the stuff with Christian and Cheyenne.
Sure.
It's horrendous, I'm not surprised he didn't talk about that. But yeah, it's a strange book.
That is something, because that, I can't even imagine what that pain might have been like. I mean, that's just, I can't even process something like that. Yeah. I mean, it's so terrible. And of course, he's going to feel responsible for how that turned out because of their upbringing. I read one of his ex-wives' books, Brando for Breakfast.
And you thought there wasn't a worse title than Brando's Smile.
Yes, I know. Brando for Breakfast. And that was Anna Kafshi, I think is her name.
Yeah.
Who wrote the book. And I read this very early on, and I remember that it included the famous photo of Brando. They were leaving divorce court, and it was a shot of her in mid-slap. She was just about to slap him. And basically, she spends a lot of that book talking about how disgusting he is and how he has a fat ass. So it's a lot. That's a preoccupation that she has in the book. And I also read, I don't know if these books were in England at the time, but here in America, certainly in the 70s and 80s, the Citadel book series were very popular. The complete films of type of book.
Not sure, maybe.
Probably some sort of equivalent there, but it's basically, you get a couple of photos from the film and then a synopsis and then reviews at the time with basic information, just basically reference books. And there was a popular one on Marlon Brando for a time. It was, one of the best-selling Marlon Brando books, or one you'd see often. In more recent years, all of the dirt on Brando you'd ever want, apart from that Peter Manso book, apparently, which I haven't read it because it's 1,000 pages. I'll get to it. But there was a book called Brando Unzipped.
Oh, yeah.
Recently, which is all, anybody who's interested in his sexual picadillos, real and or imagined, because I've read these authors before, and they are pretty wild. Every manner of unsubstantiated rumor you'll find in that book. Aside from Songs My Mother Taught Me, Conversations with Brando, and the one I'm reading now, Brando's Smile, those have really been it in terms. The other books I have are just basically films of or, reviews of his movies. it's not a large library of books. It's not comparable to Dylan or
John Lennon.
Or Lennon, or even Orson Welles. There are more biographies of Orson Welles. I wonder if he's on the same cultural icon level or if he's faded a bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll tell you a book. I'd like to recommend this to you and the listeners. I did the audio book last year. It's called Somebody, The Reckless Life and Remarkable Career of Marlon Brando. I think you should try and read it. And if you can get the audio book, I can't remember the guy's name, but he's a guy with a southern accent who's obviously done loads of audio books before. And he's just got just the right voice, you know?
Yeah, I should take that back because there were 3 Brando books within the past few years. There is that one, the one I'm reading now, and the other one was The Contender, which came out recently.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that book in particular, The Contender, is trying to rehabilitate Brando's image because he has gotten caught up in sort of a cancel culture thing on Twitter there for a little while. I don't know if that still continues. With regard to Last Tango and then something else, him having an affair with Richard Pryor. Or something yeah. But anyway, listen to me, Marlon. I wanted to see this documentary. I think it aired here on Showtime or HBO or one of those cable channels. And a friend of mine said she was going to tape it. I went over and she had the time wrong and I got the last 10 minutes. And so I hadn't seen it for years and years until you found a place. I did buy the DVD as well. So my conscience is clear. I have the DVD. Yeah. All I'm saying is you pointed me in the right direction.
Yeah.
And it was everything I wanted it to be. I do think some of it's the raw material for Songs My Mother Taught Me, or it's just Brando reminiscing. But apparently this was something that he did, that he kept these audio diaries. Funny, John Lennon attempted to do this. I don't know how far he got.
They lasted about 15 minutes. This is fucking boring.
Yeah. But Brando, I guess you could argue that maybe he just loved the sound of his own voice. This documentary, Listen to Me, Marlon, is culled from those hundreds of hours. So you're getting really like 2 hours of really incredible stuff. And I think if you're a Brando acolyte, you really should see it because there's nothing else other than a biography special. And I remember a documentary from 1981 that I saw that had very little footage in it. It's really wonderful. Just hearing him narrate it and just the idea that he would do that he would keep all of this stuff. And where is it? And why can't we hear the rest of it?
Tahitians have the beauty of sleeping children. And when they waken, they will waken into the nightmare that the white man lives in, the nightmare of the want of things. I'm interested in making enough money so that I can say, fuck you to money, but that's all. Acting afforded me the opportunity of time. I didn't have to do anything. I only had to do it once a year for 3 months at the most. It became just a way of making a living.
Well, certainly unprincipled. Lying and cheating come naturally to you. You're completely without moral qualms.
Yeah, you see, everybody's got a good side if you look for it. Lying for a living, that's what acting is. All I've done is just learned how to be aware of the process. All of you are actors, and good actors, because you're all liars. When you're saying something you don't mean, or refraining from saying something that you really do mean, that's acting. Let me give you an example. You're coming home, 4 o'clock in the morning, reeking of whiskey, and there she is waiting at the top of the stairs, your wife. You wouldn't believe me, sweetheart. You wouldn't believe what happened to me. Your mind is going 10,000 miles an hour. You're lying at the speed of light. You're lying to save your life. The last thing in the world you want her to know is the truth. You lie for peace. You lie for tranquility. You lie for love. So we all act. Some people get paid for that.
You know, I'd love to have a website somewhere where I could check in every day and listen for an hour or two. Marlon Brando, just the way his mind worked. I mean, like I was saying before, you know, he's just tapped into that wisdom. And, you know, even if he wasn't acting, even if he hadn't made those movies, that would be enough, you know? He could have just toured the country as an orator or something, or he could have used that power for evil.
Yeah.
And, you know, interesting. So your opinion of it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love it. It's a perfect companion to Songs My Mother Taught Me, really. You're sort of hearing out loud some of the stuff you read in the memoir. So,
right.
Yeah, just brilliant. Yeah, these insights, we'll get to Dick Cavett because that's one of my favourite pieces of television ever, that interview they did in 1973. Yeah. Let me segue. It's something you mentioned earlier, the Meet Marlon Brando documentary. I'm just laughing just thinking about it. I love it. By the Maysles brothers, who amazingly just a year earlier had covered the Beatles' first trip to America.
Right. What
can we say about this? It's kind of a companion almost in my sort of Brando origin story with the Connie Chung interview. But this is this is Marlon, who's 41, 42. He's getting a little bit heavy. You know, he's not what he was. He's perhaps balding a little bit. He's approaching middle age, let's say. But, you know, he's still as horny as he was before, as you mentioned earlier. There's just so many amazing moments. You know, in a way, it's the worst possible promotion for a film, because there's a bit where they say, we got to talk about your new film, Moratorium. And he's like, well, why do we have to talk about it?
Right.
And all the flirting and everything. And just like, he loves pointing out all these things that people do, like this girl has her hair over her eyes, or she talks out the side of her mouth.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, it's very charming. It's very charming. I was just going to say, the great thing is, you know, they're asking him these questions about the film.
Yeah.
He's doing everything he can to talk about something else. There is an interviewer who keeps, I don't know, he's almost sparring with Marlon, but I feel like he's not even worthy in doing it. And Brando's sort of humoring him, just making it very obvious that, you know, he even refers to himself as a huckster at some point. But I do like when he's speaking with the foreign press, when he's speaking with the French press, he's speaking French.
Yeah.
And then with German, he's speaking German. And there's a scene where they're asking him a question. He's like, you know, I'll talk about anything. I'll talk about anything. It doesn't have to be in a movie. And they ask him about, you know, what about the Negro issue in the U.S.? And he points to like a woman, like it's like a black woman walking down the street, and he's like, "Well, let's ask her."
Yeah.
And he brings her on camera and asks her the question and translates it in French. I mean, it's remarkable.
Yeah.
Distraction de cette femme, elle est ravissante. Il faut mettre le caméra là-bas. Un moment. Regarde un peu là-bas. C'est fantastique cette femme. Ça c'est un exemple. Elle est jolie. Jolie. Oui, elle est certainement jolie. Bonjour madame. Mais après cet intermède, nous pouvons... Il faut arrêter. Je vous laisse encore regarder. S'il vous plaît. Je vous laisse encore regarder. Non, c'est plus que... C'est trop pour la journée.
Are you Marlon Brando?
Yes, how do you do? It's very nice to meet you. What is your name?
Say hello.
Hello, sweetheart.
Are you making a movie here?
Just talking. Would you come in here? This is for the French press.
I think you asked me before if the American government is responsible for the progress of Negroes, and I said no. Here is a woman who can answer this question. I can ask her, and you can translate.
I'd like to ask you if you think that the American government is responsible for the progress of the Negro in recent years here in America.
No, I don't. Not at all. Whatever has been done or whatever's going to be done, they're going to have to do it. Please.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. Okay, bye.
It's funny because we were talking in one of the Beatles shows or the answer programs about seeing through the media and manipulating the media. And you were saying like John and George had kind of realized, well, like Brando really realized it. I think, I think he really took it, to the nth degree. And you can see it in that documentary or short film. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, some of the time he has a nice way of sending it up by saying, Moratori is this really amazing picture. You've got to see it or your life won't be worth it or something.
Right.
And there's a couple of other bits I remember is one of the lady interviewers says, this is a great film. And he says, have you seen it? And she goes, well, no, I haven't seen it. Well, how do you know it's a great film? Like you said earlier, it's so simple, but you just so rarely see any celebrity ever say that. And then the other one that's funny, there are a couple of interviews who are getting into the kind of Brando vibe and being very informal. And he says to the guy, you got the longest fingernails of anyone I've ever seen. And he goes, they're only long on this hand because I play classical guitar. And the other ones are trimmed so I can fret, which means put your fingers down on the fretboard. He says, do you play guitar? And he goes, no, but I fret a lot. But it's the timing. It's the timing of it. It's brilliant. That's such a good documentary. I mean, it's only 25 minutes as well.
In Boston, and our viewing audience would love to know why you're here and for you to tell us about your latest movie.
How old are you? About 23?
No, I'll be 21 in March.
21 in March?
Yes. But that's supposed to be a woman's privilege.
What is?
Her age.
What are you talking like? You're talking like an American adage.
No, please, do tell us about a new movie.
Well, why?
Because we're looking forward to seeing it in Boston.
Well, that's the thing. Are you?
No. Certainly are.
Excuse me, I didn't mean to touch your ankle. Well, what can I tell you about it?
Oh, would you like to tell us something about, behind the scenes while you were making the picture, or...
How far behind the scenes?
Just some interesting things that our audience would like to hear about.
Well, Bernie Wiki smokes the worst cigars of anybody I ever knew. I hated cigars. She was Miss USA. Is that a fact?
Yes, it is.
Well, I could have guessed.
That's very sweet of you.
Well, it's unusual to find somebody as beautiful as you are who is also a college graduate and seriously interested in world affairs and studying law.
Well, I enjoyed being Miss USA, but I'd like to grow old gracefully, so I thought we'd better
talk out of the
back it
side
up.
of your mouth. Did you ever notice that? When
No,
you talk. It's charming.
Unintentional.
It's a physical idiosyncrasy, but it's a charming one. What speech did you make when you accepted the title of Miss USA?
They had asked me to curb, or what I would do to curb juvenile delinquency at the time. I thought the best thing to do was to raise the age requirement to...
Your hair is over your eyes. We can't see your right eye.
Oh, no, talking from the side of my mouth, and we don't want to do that. But I thought we should raise the age requirement in school so that youngsters would stay until they were about 16 or 18, or at least high school graduates.
Do you think that would help curb juvenile delinquency?
I think it would be a start, keeping them busy, study more.
Certainly I'm not an expert in the field, but most education today seems to be aimed toward supplying people with information. It has very little to do with preparing them for the problems that they're going to meet in life, on an emotional level, philosophical level.
We'd like to thank Marlon Brando for being with us and giving us a little bit of insight about his views of education and... She was Miss USA. What year was that? In 64.
1964, she was Miss USA. And I asked her if she was pretty, and she said well, that was a subjective opinion, and she didn't really know.
And it was only 6 judges that decided, so I don't think it wasn't very decisive.
But you went through several stages to arrive finally at the title, didn't you?
Yes.
So it was really more than 6 judges.
Well, 6 here and 6 there, and I was very honored. But Mr. Brando, thank you so much for being my guest.
Good night, folks. Smoke optimal cigars.
But first, remember Marlon Brando in the 20th Century Fox motion picture, Moratori. It's a great picture, and he's a great actor.
For God's sake, go see that, will you? Because you really won't know how to proceed in life if you don't see Moratori.
It's one of the most important things you'll ever do.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of say Songs My Mother Taught Me, Meet Marlon Brando, and Listen to Me Marlon is your kind of Marlon starter kit,
Yeah.
For anyone listening who maybe doesn't know anything apart from his films. So, yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think we've covered his childhood, and I think the 50s, his initial impact, and then the 70s with obviously Godfather and Last Tango has been well documented. But this 60s period, now you had a couple of these films in your top 10.
Yes.
I don't know if that was to be deliberately perverse or you actually rated them highly.
I do like them. You know, I am very fond of them. I have an affection for those movies, so I went with favorites, not necessarily best, you know.
Oh, totally, yeah. I mean, nobody needs like a top 10 Marlon Brando films by film experts, wherever you can find plenty of those. So it's all personal, isn't it? But this 60s kind of, I don't know, let's say wilderness period or box office poison period. I think it generally comes down to two films, One-Eyed Jacks and then Mutiny on the Bounty, which follow each other. Yeah. So with One-Eyed Jacks, let me tell you the stories I've heard, and you can tell me whether, as far as you know, which ones are true. So the legends of the making, obviously Stanley Kubrick came in. One story I heard was that him and Kubrick, because Kubrick obviously was very eccentric, so it was like Mr. Eccentric versus Mr. Eccentric. And they spent weeks and weeks lying around, and then Brando had a gong, and when the discussions got too heavy, he would start banging this gong. And then the famous story of him sitting on the beach waiting for the right wave, you know, these are great tabloid fodder, you know. Yeah. And then all the affairs, because the mother and daughter in the film, Katie Gerardo, who, I mean, I only saw this film for the first time last week, and I just fell in love with her. Like, the daughter was nice, but I fell in love with Katie Gerardo instantly. Brando was rumored to have been having an affair with her for a number of years. And then another podcast said that he had an affair with the young lady who unfortunately killed herself, didn't she, quite soon after this. And then, I mean, all the other stories, I think we already talked about, you know, apparently 1 million feet of film was shot. So what do we know, or what do you know, and what is rumor? Do we know anything?
Well,
God.
I've heard the Kubrick stuff, not necessarily the relationship stuff, although I'm sure it's in that big 1,000-page Brando biography. Katie Gerardo did a bunch of Westerns, right?
High Noon was the first one.
Yes, right, exactly. I mean, I find it very easy to believe that he would have an affair with both of them. You know, I could even see him doing that deviously for the sake of shaping performances almost. It's funny. I know One-Eyed Jacks was not a success when it came out, and he got slammed for that. Mutiny on the Bounty was a success, but he continued to get slammed for that movie. Like, the making of both of those films, it was sort of a mirror. Boy, I hate to keep bringing it back to Orson Welles, but it's like
go for it.
It's a mirror to the Orson Welles story, the Magnificent Ambersons and the trauma and the tabloid stories surrounding that, and then it was taken away from him, and it sort of ruined his reputation that he was a guy who was always going over budget. He wasn't working. He was pocketing the money and living extravagantly on the studio's dime. And I think Marlon got tainted with the same, with the same brush, although there is a kernel of truth to some of that. Certainly One-Eyed Jacks, you reach that point where you want to give him an inch and he'll take a mile. It's you want the artist to thrive and be able to do his thing, but you don't want it to become self-indulgent to the point where, like Brian Wilson said, you can experiment and experiment and experiment yourself right out of action.
End up doing nothing almost.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what happened.
Having just read Songs My Mother Taught Me, as I said, if I had a criticism, he's very quick to distance himself. He admits about all the women and everything. And he does make one very good point, which again is something that nobody wants to hear, which is that monogamy is actually entirely unnatural. It's a very, very modern phenomenon. It's like careers and having a boss and working in an office. I mean, okay, I guess tribes had chiefs, so maybe there was always a boss. But, he makes a good point there. But he's very quick to admit most of the affairs he had, and kind of also says that, that it's quite juvenile, this behavior. He's in his 50s and still sort of escaping at 3:00 in the morning from houses where the husband comes home, where he's having an affair with a wife. But he's very clear with One-Eyed Jacks and Mutiny on the Bounty that he certainly doesn't say that he caused any trouble. But then, there's so many accounts. I mean, on Mutiny, Trevor Howard, Richard Harris, a couple of others. I mean, they can't all be lying. I mean, they do say it with affection. Whenever Richard Harris talks about Brando, he'll kind of say that he was a nightmare, but he'll kind of say it with a bit of a smile, as if he almost had a begrudging admiration for him. And I think with One-Eyed Jacks, there's always this conflict. It's always art versus commerce, isn't it? You've got the money men in Hollywood. They don't want to indulge the artist too much because it's costing money, obviously. Right. And again, in the book, I mean, I can't believe this, but he says in the book, "Oh, I'm paying Carl Malden $250,000 a week," which can't be right. I mean, that must be just a bit of an exaggeration, particularly in 1961.
Right. What I do remember about, I don't remember it about Mutiny on the Bounty. It's not like I was around, but sometimes it feels like I was. I've read so much about the making of that film that the tabloid aspect of it, the constant negative stories, I mean, he was really a fixture of the tabloids. That the making of that movie was legendary before it even came out, and not in a good way. And I'm assuming that after years of just outright praising Marlon, and it was the old story of now we got to tear him down, and here is the perfect excuse to do it. Because yes, maybe he is too powerful on Mutiny on the Bounty. I mean, you could argue one way or another. Obviously, the results speak for themselves. I mean, it's a flawed film, but it's a very successful film, and it was in your top 10.
Yeah.
But I do get the feeling it was like, well, now we can really take him down. Let's go in on it. And I think that coupled with his choice of projects, because he'd gotten to the point where he was powerful enough that he could choose what he was going to be in. I think those two things began his downward spiral in the 60s, or he was appearing in movies that, boy, just had a lot of bad luck. Maybe started out as high-profile projects, or there was good pedigree involved, and then they just never really came off. I think about this interview that he did, I guess it was with Mike Douglas, and Coppola's in the interview. He brings Coppola out.
1975, that is, by the way.
Right, and Mike Douglas says something, what made you want to do The Godfather? And Marlon says something like, well, the fact that, somebody wanted to hire me. Alluding to that wilderness period, where he was box office poison.
The one that I think is really a missed opportunity, because I haven't seen a lot of those films, but The Chase.
Yes.
You got Jane Fonda, Robert Redford, pretty stellar cast. And Brando, again, as his career went on, particularly in the 80s, I mean, I saw The Formula, and I didn't think it was too bad. And he's kind of weirdly effective because he's so low energy.
Right.
He makes the character low energy. So this sort of jaded sheriff in The Chase, this oil guy who's kind of, I'm going to say fat with success, the other meaning of fat, meaning too indulged.
Right.
I think he brought that to his roles. And even the score, which I mentioned earlier, which I just saw the other night, which is fantastic, I thought. But The Chase kind of felt had a lot of potential. I don't think that was his fault, according to the last biography.
Well, Reflections in a Golden Eye from 1967 with Elizabeth Taylor. So you've got, homosexuality in the military. Well, that's going to be a pretty tough subject to do justice to in 1967. So to his credit to do something challenging like that, but there's just really no way that movie could be everything it could be. And it just comes across, the movie just falls flat when you see it. It's like The Chase. He's great in it, and you sit there and go, oh, what a great character, and he's doing great, and everything about him is compelling. I just wish it were a better movie. I wish he was wandering around in a better film.
It's always fascinating to think what happens with these, though. I'd love to just be once a fly on the wall and see how the script gets revised and all the power plays that must go on. When you think about when you've got, let's think of a film. What's a film where you had a lot of other strong characters in it, as in strong personalities? I don't know. I can't think of anything at the top of my head. I'm sure there's loads.
From that period?
From any period, really. What can we think? Well, I suppose One-Eyed Jack said Ben Johnson. I don't know much about him as a guy, but I imagine he was quite a strong character.
Yeah.
But then you take something like The Godfather. I feel like Pacino, Duvall, and James Caan, I think they all either revered Brando or just, I think him and Caan were probably into the same sort of jokes, wouldn't they? They get that feeling.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Duvall seems like a nice guy. I don't know any of these people, of course, and Pacino is obviously, I think you were asking me earlier who is the successor to Brando, and I think it's either Pacino or De Niro, I'd say.
Right.
Because the young Pacino, I think it's just spectacular. I mean, just had that run from Godfather, Serpico, Godfather Part 2, Dog Day Afternoon. I mean, wow.
There have been a lot of would-be Brandos, a lot of actors who were pegged to be the next Brando. A perfect example would be Mickey Rourke.
Oh, yeah.
Who for a number of years, one project after another, it was like everything he touched was, I remember reading movie magazines in the 80s, where they were, the sky's the limit for Mickey Rourke. And he did have his comeback with The Wrestler.
Yeah, that's good, isn't it?
So in a way, maybe that does follow the Brando model, I suppose. I hate to use that expression, never fulfilled its potential, because who are we to determine what the potential is, But there's some good work in this. Obviously, I put a bunch of those movies in my top 10. There was some good work. I just think that they have not been reevaluated. It seems like everything eventually gets reevaluated, right?
Yeah.
Every movie
around.
eventually. Yeah, like The Chase you mentioned before. I'm sure somebody is going to champion that movie in a couple of years. I mean, look at what happened with Touch of Evil, the Orson Welles picture. That was a flop and nobody really cared about it for decades. And now to even say anything negative about it, sacrilege. So I could see some of that happening. Maybe not with Candy. Although I would like it to happen with Candy.
I think that's like so bad it's good.
Yeah.
In that category, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. All right. And then, like I said, the 70s, I think we kind of know what was going on there. But he was away from a 1980 formula until Dry White Season in 89. And I love when he said to Connie Chung, I spent most of the time watching the ants go up the wall.
Right.
and I love that because it's that kind of weird, we were saying earlier, he's this bizarre mix of very loud and quite extrovert, but then he's got that meditative, because people who meditate, they talk about that kind of thing, focusing on small details. And Connie Chung, of course, says, is that all you've been doing for 10 years? He's like, well, obviously not. But
well, if his library is anything to go by, I mean, he was doing a heck of a lot of reading all those years, a heavy reader. And I suppose recording his thoughts for what purpose, we're not quite sure, but just keeping those audio diaries.
I mean, you're a big reader, aren't you? And I am as well. It's something amazingly, and again, to go back to meditation, they're always talking about finding your center, finding that place where you're just kind of calm and you feel centered, and just sitting in a comfortable chair reading a book.
Well, it's funny
especially
because
if you're on a beach as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and in that book I keep referencing, just because I'm reading it now, the ill-fated Brando smile. He does mention in one of his letters that he sends out to one of his fans. Actually, Brando did respond to fan letters, which I thought was interesting. He said that, when he's reading all these various books, he's obviously seeing himself in the main characters. So I think, reading is like meditation, as you say, because you are going to learn about yourself through whatever book you happen to be reading. Well, let's hope, if you're reading a book on Phil Spector, maybe you don't see too much of yourself in it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of introspection, I guess, during those years. But, yeah, Dry White Season, I remember he got great reviews for that, even though that's a supporting part. And that was seen as kind of the first of, maybe not the first, but the second or third of many comebacks.
Yeah. Well, he was interested, I think, because of,
subject matter.
Yeah. I mean, the word cause, unfortunately, has become almost like derogatory. It's like, Brando's chasing another cause. It's so sad that when a celebrity is actually trying to help the world, I'm sure some people do it to be fashionable, but I don't think Marlon Brando did. It's such a shame that, obviously the Sashi and Little Feather thing, I think from everything I heard about that night, that just shows you what the Oscars actually is. It's just a kind of circle jerk.
Right.
Let's pat ourselves on the back, and if anyone tries to rain on our parade by mentioning anything serious, he's going to get booed off the stage,
Right.
That's the way I see that, anyway. Yeah, so he has this, let's call it a hiatus. He comes back. I mean, you have to really remember that he actually acted for another 12 years.
Yeah.
But is there anything, I guess we talked about The Freshman, is there anything of substance in that 90s stuff? Or was he largely phoning it in, would you say? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a performance where, let's put it this way. He's always interested. He can't not be. Also, at this time, I'm going to draw that Orson Welles comparison again. His weight ballooned. He was just this obese man on screen, and that couldn't help but affect what he could do on screen. I mean, with Island of Dr. Moreau and things like that, he's pretty much sedentary throughout all of the rest of these movies. Even the score, I mean, he's basically sitting down. Yes, he's an older man at that point, but there's really not much that he can actually do. I think he does invest a lot of himself in that strange comedy Free Money, which I mentioned before, which went right to video. Hardly anyone's seen it. That's a very bizarre comedy playing this crazed Swedish father trying to prevent his daughter from having sex. Doesn't sound like a promising plot as I describe it. It's really not. He does actually put a lot of gusto in that performance. Why that one? I don't know. But other ones like Don Juan DeMarco, that was a successful film, right? It's Faye Dunaway and Johnny Depp in that movie. But I think these things are trifles, really. You know, they're just not substantial. You know?
I get the feeling, though, he enjoyed working with, I mean, I don't know for a fact, but Johnny Depp, Ed Norton, Matthew Broderick. I think he liked kind of being a kind of a mentor or a guru to these guys because they obviously were in awe of him. I don't know whether De Niro was or whether De Niro would show that because in the score, I mean, De Niro's in his 50s, you know, he's not a spring chicken. So I think he enjoyed that part. And it's very interesting you mentioning Orson Welles because honestly, I've never met anyone else who constantly compares them because that's what I always do. I always think, and let's make an effortless segue. I was just going to mention actually about John Lennon, my own pet parallel as well. In the Dakota years, you know, regardless of what you think was actually the case, he read voraciously. But Fred Seaman made a very good point. He said John Lennon's problem was that his head was full of knowledge from probably thousands of books he'd read, but he couldn't apply it to his own life. Like he couldn't repair the relationship with Julian. Arguably, he may have done it if he'd lived. I wonder if Brando had a little bit of that. You know, all those books didn't help him in the case of Christian or Cheyenne. And not to say that it's really his fault, but he'd tell you, he wasn't the greatest parent in the world. And
well, I mean, I guess that's a segue into talking about that if you wanted to get into those. Yeah,
we absolutely will. I just want to talk about, with Orson Welles, I want to talk about any collaborations you feel like Marlon could have had in his life that would have gone well. And I'm going to say Orson Welles. Laurence Olivier is another one. Laurence Olivier, of course, was up for The Godfather. He was kind of in the running for that. And that could have worked because when I saw Marathon Man, I saw Laurence Olivier as a Nazi. We covered it on this podcast, actually. I was just so blown away by how convincing he was. So I'm sure Olivier could have pulled that off.
Sure.
And then I was telling you the other day about my, with Marilyn Monroe, when I found out that Marlon and Marilyn Monroe were friends, quote unquote, and then obviously had an affair. I kind of had this fantasy of them getting together and living happily ever after, but I suppose that would never have happened. In the Somebody biography, the one I read last year, they make a parallel because I think Marilyn got involved with the Lee Strasberg school as well. And she was not just a dumb blonde. You know, she obviously had some intelligence. And they make a parallel between her and Marlon Brando that they were in a similar position. I think Marlon was obviously more respected intellectually than she was, but I'm sure they would have made a dynamite film. So can you think of any other collaborations that you think might have been interesting?
You know, the Brando and Marilyn Monroe, that has a lot of promise. I don't know if on a personal level, if they would have been in it for the long haul, but I think they would have made a good film together. I think about the collaborations that didn't work, like Marlon Brando and Chaplin. That was a disaster from what I understand. But I could see Brando and Orson Welles, but boy, I don't know how much film would have been shot or the movie would be unfinished.
Yeah.
I don't know with the two of them who had a tendency to be self-indulgent. I don't know how that would have gone, but
I think it would have gone either one of two ways. The egos would have just magically balanced. Right. They would have just admired each other and seen the similarities, or the similarities would have just driven them mad and they would have seen everything they hated about themselves in the other guy. Right. It would have gone one of those two ways. That's the only way exactly.
They would have spent a lot of time having, big lavish dinners and long conversations into the evening with getting very little work done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I know people have said, if Marlon Brando had done a film with James Dean, that would have been wonderful. And I just don't see the James Dean thing. We had talked about that.
Yeah, we talked about it the other day, didn't we?
Yeah, James Dean is just, I don't quite get it. I don't have anything against him, and I think he's good when he's good, but, I just never thought of him as being in that class as a Brando.
I'm fairly similar, yeah. I don't really find him that interesting. But then we don't know, what would have happened,
I mean, I would have liked to have seen, I don't know, did Brando do any work with Ken Russell? I mean, that would have been a very strange picture if they had done something.
That would have been quite good, actually, yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe working with British directors for some reason, because I think from the book I just read, it seems like he makes these kind of slight sort of positive stereotypes about Europe that, European filmmakers are much more interested in art and America's only interested in commerce. And I think that's a bit too general. But, I think the British film industry does pride itself, because we have a very strong stage tradition. And obviously America's got Broadway. But I think Brando was saying in the Connie Chung interview that Orson Welles was the nearest they came to a national theatre. But I feel like, I think he enjoyed working with Michael Winner. And I feel like, Ken Russell, maybe even like, I don't know, Ken Loach, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe Ken Loach was a bit later. Mike Leigh. Do you know much about Mike Leigh?
Yes, Mike Leigh, sure.
That would have been interesting, yeah. If you'd been able to rein him in somehow.
What about French directors?
Did he work with any?
I mean, he never worked with Truffaut.
Oh, yeah.
Just makes me think about something. Could Brando, I mean, a British director, but could Brando have worked with Alfred Hitchcock?
Ooh, yeah, I can't see it somehow. Again, whenever I think about this, just think about Howard the Egos, because that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
When we did the Lennon and Dylan show on my other podcast with Ben Burrell, we talked about how magically when Dylan met the Beatles, the egos just seemed to match. Whereas maybe with Elvis, again, we don't know, but maybe with Elvis, it just didn't quite gel or for whatever reason. But
you think Hitchcock needed more of a, and I say this with all due respect to Cary Grant, he needed more of a blank page?
Yeah, maybe. Have you read the book, The Dark Side of Genius?
No.
Oh, that is really good. It's Donald Spotto. He's pretty well known.
Okay, sure, yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I'd really recommend that one, The Dark Side of Genius by Alfred Hitchcock. Yeah, well, he was a dark guy. I don't know if you've ever heard of the 10 Rillington Place murder case from England.
No.
Well, they made the film with Richard Attenborough. Alfred Hitchcock was almost obsessed with that. And he said, even said in a candid moment, he's lucky that he found an outlet for these, I'm going to say almost murderous impulses. I'm not saying that Alfred Hitchcock would have actually ever killed anyone, but he found an outlet for that really dark side of his personality.
Well, I interviewed Tippi Hedren, and she told me about, some of his behavior, which would certainly fall under the category of dark, his sort of obsessive behavior. She said that one actress, she didn't name names, but she said to get away from him, one actress got pregnant and, got married and quit the business because he was... Because that could be another discussion. I don't know if you've ever done a Hitchcock episode.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many possibilities. There's Orson Welles, there's Hitchcock, Robert De Niro.
Yeah,
I think I'll probably, in the future, stick to films, but then we could discuss the person while discussing the film. I just think with this opportunity to do Brando, it's just too good to pass up. And it's just so much. It's unbelievable. Okay, let's talk about some of the interviews. We'll go through these fairly quickly. There's two from the 50s. There's the Ed Sullivan one and Edwin R. Morrow. I'll get you to talk about Marlon and his father on camera. But these two are this is Marlon basically playing the game.
Yeah.
I mean, he went to it's just after he won the Oscar for On the Waterfront. He went to the ceremony. He behaved himself. He looked pleased. Is there any hint of perhaps what he really thought, or is he just, would you say he's 100% playing the game here?
Yeah, I think he's playing the game here. He's new to Hollywood. He's grateful. He was naive, I think, in the very beginning. I think you had said something about, the letter he had written to the UN. So, he was naive about things. I don't think that it took a couple of years. I know that he posed with Bob Hope, where they're playfully arguing over the statue, the Oscar.
Oh, right.
That was a running gag that Bob Hope never got an Oscar. So he was happy to do those kind of publicity things. And I guess around that same time, he also did that interview with Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
They showed up at that fundraising event. And when is that Studs Terkel interview? Is that or is that maybe a little later? That's 63 maybe?
Studs Terkel is 63, yeah.
Yeah, okay, it's a little later.
Just makes you think more and more that him and Marilyn should have got together and given it a go at least.
Yeah. the Ed Sullivan one is basically Brando talking about his bongos and his love of jazz, and Ed, surprisingly, well, Ed covered Broadway and Ed was heavily into music, so Ed seems to be right there with him. It's one of the few times I've ever seen Ed Sullivan appear excited about anything. Is when he's talking to Marlon Brando. I always wonder how Ed Sullivan, who, I mean, that show was not seen in Britain. I always wondered, would he have gone over well in Britain? Because he's a strange guy to be an impresario. He has the countenance of an undertaker, you know.
Yeah, he kind of looks a tiny bit like Richard Nixon, not in the features, but just a very, very square jaw and a very sort of stiff. Right. Everything's very stiff. Can you give us a quick Ed Sullivan? Just a couple of lines. Go on.
Right here on our stage, ladies and gentlemen, these youngsters from Liverpool call themselves the Beatles. Tonight you'll be twice entertained by them. I mean, it's just, and even the way he speaks is bizarre. Tonight you'll be twice entertained.
Yeah, we got a telegram here from Elvis Presley. Definitely written by Elvis Presley, not by his manager.
I thought it was a really swell, decent thing for him to do.
I was watching. I got the DVDs of Beatles and Ed Sullivan. I watched the whole show. Okay. He just keeps going, Mitzi Gaynor. We're just always waiting for Mitzi Gaynor to turn up. Mitzi Gaynor, the second half of our show, etc. But yeah, talk about Marlon and his dad on camera.
Oh, what a strange! Here you know, this is the very definition of playing the game. And Marlon's playing the game. I guess like his father is trying, and I don't even know why it was decided to have him there. Because, I mean, the Edward R. Murrow show, the person-to-person program, the idea was that you were going to go inside the celebrity's home. That was the whole point of that show. I mean, these kind of things are very popular today. It was, it's like Cribs before that show existed. And everybody was on it. Marilyn Monroe was on it. Frank Sinatra was in a house that looked like a movie studio set. I mean, I don't even think it was really his house. I'm assuming that this was Brando's house. And I guess the idea was we'll have Brando's father there because it humanizes Brando, or it makes him appear normal, or it shows that he's the good son and he's providing for his father. But I think that's the interview where Edward R. Murrow says, were you proud when Marlon won the Oscar? And the father says, proud of him as an actor, no. Proud of him as a man, yes. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Does he have, I guess his father had just contempt for the acting profession, or thought it was, you know, frivolous. You can see Marlon like wincing when he says he has this smile on his face. It's that frozen smile. It's when you're embarrassed, but you can't not smile because you're on camera. So you just have it frozen there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very weird, isn't it?
Marlon, I know your dad's in town tonight. Is he hiding out somewhere?
Well, he's up behind the wall quaking with fear, never having been on television. I'll get him in here. Pop, come on out. Don't fall down the stairs with...
Now, we'll ask Mr. Brando some questions about his son, and I'm sure we'll get the blunt and direct answers. Good evening, Mr. Brando.
Good evening, Mr. Morrow.
I imagine you're just a bit proud of your son right now, aren't you?
Well, as an actor, not too proud, but as a man, why, quite proud.
Mr. Brando, tell me this. Was he hard to handle as a child?
I think he had the usual childhood traits. I think he had probably a little more trouble with his parents than most children do.
You mean bringing them up properly?
What was that?
You mean bringing his parents up properly?
Training them in the way they should go.
Yes. Marlon, in the interests of justice and fairness, would you like 30 seconds to defend yourself?
Well, I really don't feel I need to defend myself. I can lick this guy with one hand, so let it go.
Tell me, you and your sisters were very lucky to be able to grow up on a farm. Did you ever look back on those days?
I look back quite often, Ed. I had an awful lot of fun from the time I was about 14 to the time I was 17. We lived in the country on a farm. We didn't run the farm. We just lived on the house. And we had cows, and one cow. Her name was Violet. And my mom named it. And I used to milk the cow every day, except when I had a heavy date. I had to go someplace early, and then my pop took over. The cow was kind of small, and he wasn't used to it, so all the milk went up his sleeve. He missed the bucket completely. So he used to come in the house with a sleeve full of milk and serve it, arm style. But we had woods and a river, and we used to run down in the woods after school and put pennies on the tracks and watch the train run over it. And I look back upon that part of my life as rather nostalgically and very pleasantly.
Well, Marlon, from what you've told me, I gather your mother must have been a rather tolerant sort of person, wasn't she?
Yes, my ma was. As a matter of fact, here's about the only personal effect I have in the house. This is a portrait of my ma when she was about, how old was she, Pop?
40.
About 40. And she was, I was just pausing because it's an odd thing. The night of the award was the anniversary of my ma's passing away. So it's been kind of a lot of mixed feelings, and it's odd that it should, we bring it up now.
Yeah, I could say, was that his real house or was that some set they built?
Right.
Who knows?
Well, because the one with Sinatra's going through the house and he keeps saying, oh, we just moved here, and I'm not even sure. He's opening up cabinets and going, oh, look, here we have plates. And you're thinking, this is not a real house. This is completely phony.
It'd be funny if Brando said, here's my bedroom where all the magic happens. And then writes a list of all the women who've been in there. Anyway, then we get, there's quite a few from the 60s. There's a 2-hour one that we both just discovered, and I haven't managed to get through it. I probably will at some point, so audio only. But then we have the Johnny Carson one. I think he was on Carson a few times, but this just popped up online from 68, just after Martin King had died. And Marlon is he's imploring people to give, is it 1% or 10%? 1%, like a tithe, isn't it, almost?
I think it's 10%, isn't it?
10%. He said, I think he says like no lower than 1%.
Right.
And I never really liked Carson much. I always just preferred, since I discovered Dick Cavett about 10 years ago, I always just felt like Cavett was a more natural and slightly more intellectual. But perhaps, have I underestimated Carson? What do you think about his show?
Yeah, I think at the time, Carson's program could become that. Cavett worshipped Carson, wrote for him, and Cavett also worshipped Jack Parr. Jack Parr is probably more similar to Dick Cavett than Carson was. I think Carson's show evolved over time and became very fluff, where you go on and just promote your movie, show a clip, and leave. The Carson show had, the wedding of Tiny Tim. I mean, they had a lot of strange things on at the time. But when Marlon was on, I thought that was interesting because you rarely see anything from that era from the Carson program, and you rarely see anybody going on at length about a cause. And I thought Marlon was too good for the room, I mean, sitting there with Ed McMahon, God knows what was going through Ed McMahon's mind when that was happening. But yeah, what did you think of his appearance on that program?
Yeah, it's interesting. From memory, wasn't he wearing a suit and tie?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and then on Cavett a few years later, it's completely different. Got
the
wearing
60s,
a kind of a scarf, yeah.
Yeah, the 60s caught up with him. It took a while.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. He's very earnest. He's very sincere.
Yep.
Johnny Carson, is not making fun of him, which could have happened,
Right.
I mean, look at talk shows now. I don't know. I don't really watch much American talk shows, but in Britain, I mean, it's just evolved.
They're exactly the same.
Yeah, it's just evolved into this. Yeah. Oh, God.
We've got variations of Graham Norton here. In fact, we've got Graham Norton here, so.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's his name? Who's the English guy?
James Corden.
James Corden, yeah. Anyway, so we go a bit forward to Dick Cavett, and I remembered Cavett from Forrest Gump, weirdly enough, years and years ago, but I kind of discovered him basically with YouTube, really, and now there's a Dick Cavett Show channel, and there are new clips pretty much every day.
Yes.
And they're just, I just love it. Like, I mean, him and Muhammad Ali, again, there was a great documentary, Ali and Cavett, The Tale of the Tapes. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Right.
And it turns out there's a really funny, again, there's a newly uploaded Muhammad Ali interview that's actually got Woody Allen on it as well, though Woody Allen doesn't say much. And one of the interviews, it turns out that one of the jokes that Ali said on one of the shows in the 60s, Dick Cavett had actually written, and Muhammad Ali didn't know it. And he tells him on one of the shows, oh, you know that poem you did? I wrote that. So Cavett was amazing with Muhammad Ali. He's had other people, Robert Shaw, I've mentioned to you off mic, is an actor I absolutely love. Again, I feel his career didn't really do himself justice.
And he had a wonderful interview with Orson Welles and everybody. I mean, Betty Davis was on there, Katharine Hepburn. I know that before this channel, they released these deluxe DVD sets.
Yes.
It was, the Hollywood greats. And I believe the Brando interview is part of that set. But, you can watch all of this stuff on YouTube now. Yeah, Cavett's a very different bird from the typical talk show host. I don't know who would be, I'm sure there was an equivalent in Britain to Cavett. Parkinson
Parkinson wasn't bad in the 70s, I must say. Yeah. If you watch those back.
You have one guest for an hour, or, in Cavett's case, if the guest was big enough, it'd be one guest, but sometimes he'd have, Janis Joplin and Raquel Welch on the same program.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what they call in podcast land a deep dive, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And now you just get the most shallow dive. I mean, it's
right.
It's almost like a political debate. Nowadays, political debates, I was joking to someone, talk about the economy. You've got 90 seconds.
Right, exactly. I do remember that when Brando came out, he gets like the longest ovation from the audience. It just goes on and on. Maybe people were shocked to see him on television or, he was a big star, so I can understand why they were just thrilled to see him. But, Cavett, no matter what the subject is, Cavett's really good at being on the same page, and there's a humility with Cavett that I don't think is false modesty. He will say, I'm not really well-versed in this, so can you tell me more about it without it sounding, like he's setting someone up.
Yeah. I'll link to the full interview. In fact, it's an hour because he brings some Native Americans from, what's the name of that committee? I don't want to insult them by not remembering it.
It's not AIM.
Oh, it is AIM, isn't it? American Indian Movement.
Yeah, American Indian Movement, yeah. Okay.
American Indian Movement, yeah. But the rest of the interview, someone on YouTube's actually done a breakdown of all the body language. And what I just absolutely love about it is that there's a certain comfort in the discomfort. So they kind of sit there. There's these long pauses.
Right.
Brando is just so alpha and so confident that he could just sit there smiling at Cavett. And the way he smiles at him is just fantastic. I just love everything about it because it's just so natural and it's entertaining in its apparent awkwardness. But apparently they'd spent like 4 hours on the phone.
Right. And and they kind of got it all out of their system before they went on camera.
Yeah, and then they have this brilliant kind of, I'd say argument, very, very friendly argument about what acting is. And Cavett says, we already talked about this on the phone.
Yeah.
I can't do what you do. I can't do it night after night. And then Cavett says, I think he says, like, we're on the phone, you reeled off all these observations you made about me, and I thought I could never work again. And then he reels off a load more, and he's saying, you got all these things to think about. Is the lighting right? Is he happy? Is it time for a joke? And I'm going to include a clip.
Why do you downgrade acting as a profession?
What makes you think I do?
Well, I've read it in the press. Saw it in black and white. The press, I don't know what we can believe in this country. You know what I mean, though you've said over the years, it's not a fit profession for a man.
In an effort to help your ratings,
Don't worry about it.
I'll maybe say something. I think that we couldn't survive a second if we weren't able to act. Acting is a survival mechanism, and it's a social unguent, and we act to save our lives actually every day. People lie constantly every day by not saying something that they think, or saying something that they don't think, or showing something that they don't feel, or trying to give the appearance of feeling something that they don't actually. I said that, didn't I?
Yeah, but that's not acting.
That is acting. That is.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
But you know what I mean. Right?
When you're frightened and nervous in this chair, or you're distressed or uncomfortable, or you're very angry,
yeah,
and you know that that is not what is necessary to, well, what cannot be shown here. You control your face. You're a highly controlled person. And
really?
And you have to do that.
But you know what I mean is, we got into this on the phone. you say that that's acting. That's not. I'm motivated at that moment to do that, and I can do it. And suppose there's a guy here that I think is a schmuck, is a bore, and you invite frankness. I can act like he's interested for a time. I'm motivated by that. But if you wake me up at 9 or 8 the following morning and say, do that same performance before a camera and then do it again and again, I can't. Some people can. Some people do it wonderfully, and you seem to do it better than almost anybody. And so there've got to be gradations. I won't hear of the fact that what you do is no more than what I do.
Well, that isn't true. If you're working for an ad agency, some product, and you hate the guy that, the idea man, the boss, and you know that every time he comes in with some impossible notion, something that really makes you gag when you drive home on the freeway, you know damn well that you're not going to get a raise, or you're not going to get it shifted out of the position that you're in if you don't say, Leonard, I think that's terrific. Yeah. It's just beautiful. And you even lean forward, put your elbows on to show enthusiasm, and you get a face for it, and you do it day after day after day in order to survive in your job.
But if you had to do the line, Leonard, I think that's terrific 6 times, and get something deeper and better into it time after time, that takes an actor.
What did you say?
I said, those are one-time things where you have an immediate motivation.
No, they're not one-time things because it's a daily procedure.
Yeah, but the dialogue changes all the time. But you're able to
The dialogue changes, but the motivation doesn't.
Are you saying that I could play any role you can play as well as you can?
Well, that might not be true, but I don't think that I could play some roles as well as you could play them. I don't think I could play the role that you're playing now.
But this is me. I'm letting it all hang out.
No, it's not me.
It isn't. This ain't me.
I mean, you're thinking of 60 things at once. How is it going? Is it getting dull? Is he upset and distressed and inarticulate? Is he bored? Is he offended? Yeah, here's a good time for a joke. We haven't got much time. You're thinking about 9 million things and reacting to what I say, and how's that going to be? Is that going to be offensive? No, that's good. So you're doing this editing at an insane rate. And I mean, and you have to do that, and that's your job. And you have this demeanor of levity and lightness and amusement and zest, and it's easy to ascertain that finally isn't what goes on in your mind or your feelings at all.
I just feel like all my clothes have been taken off.
She's a great line, but yeah, just love it. Anything else about that one?
No, I mean, it's interesting that the talk shows of that time, and it wasn't really just Cavett. I guess there was some sort of a deal made that we can bring this person on provided you allow me to bring on, in this case, you know, members of a tribe or whatever, with Lennon on Mike Douglas. I'll come on, but I want to be able to bring on a guest every day of my choosing. And you would never see that today. I don't think you would ever see any kind of guest wielding that kind of power, or the talk shows being so open to that idea.
I don't know if you've ever seen much of Jonathan Ross. You must have seen some of that on YouTube.
Sure. Uh-huh.
I mean, he's got potential. I think he's an intelligent guy, but I feel like his show, I don't really watch much of it anymore, but I see clips every now and again. It's just devolved into this, essentially, it mirrors our culture in that it's basically the low attention span, or sort of forced low concentration span.
It's interesting that these guys, and I'm sure Jonathan Ross is going to be the same, as soon as their show ends, like here, Letterman or Conan O'Brien, they start up a podcast where they start up some sort of an internet show where they do exactly what you and I are hoping that they would do the entire time. So, you know, Letterman has a show where he has a long form interview with someone, and it's really engrossing, and you think to yourself, why wasn't he doing this, you know, the last 10 years? And the same with Conan O'Brien has a show where he brings somebody on, and it's someone who would never even have been booked on the regular talk show. So, you know, we'll probably see Jonathan Ross flourish once he's off the air.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, he's got the potential. And he's always had a nice mix of sort of levity and seriousness. I'm sure he would have been a fan of Cavett. I'm sure he'd say that.
Right.
You know. But again, with Cavett, he was always under pressure because his ratings weren't very high. And I took that as essentially because his show was a bit too intellectual or
oh yeah,
it wasn't soundbitey enough. And that's kind of the price you pay. So I think you're absolutely right. When they get a podcast and they've got no one imposing a time limit, you probably see the potential. So I think you're right.
Well,
I think you're right.
It's to Cavett's credit. He was doing that before podcasts existed.
Exactly, yeah.
And just putting it on television and suffering for it,
Yeah.
But he did have a big college audience. So he always had I'm sure you've seen the famous Woodstock episode, right? Where he brings on,
Grace Slick and Crosby,
right?
And Joni Mitchell, yeah.
And it's wonderful. He's like the only one who would be able to do something like that. Boy, it's turning into the Cavett show.
Yeah.
But he's written wonderful books. He's really a treasure. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah, all I was going to say was I just remembered another one, the Jimi Hendrix interview.
Yes.
Just fantastic. And Jimi Hendrix comes up with this brilliant line. He says, you're a disciplined guy. Do you get up every day and work? And Jimi Hendrix says, well, I try to get up every day. There's a pause. Anyway, let's move on. Yeah, so Connie Chung, I think we said 1989 interview. Definitely recommend that to the listeners. And then Larry King, I think, again, we've
talked about that.
Yeah, there's not too much more to say, but it's pretty funny. Yeah. Travolta did a decent takeoff of Brando on SNL. Yeah.
I heard it on the radio before I had seen it because Larry King's program was simulcast on the radio. So I remember taping it when it was on live. I had a cassette ready to go, and it didn't really translate as well until when you see it on television, you see what a circus it was. I don't know what that was all about. I think that was some theater that Brando was putting together.
Yeah, I think again, Larry King was kind of in awe of him or just realized that he's with a sort of alpha male, much stronger personality kind of thing. Brando's going to do what he wants, basically, especially because they're in his house as well.
Did you ever see, I mean, we're going off on so many tangents here.
Don't worry.
Did you ever see the Larry King interview with Morrissey?
No.
There is one, and it's so bizarre. It's so strange. First you have Morrissey. The whole thing seems like it was arranged by Morrissey as I don't think this was something Larry King would have, I've got to get Morrissey on the show. It's my live stream. And then Morrissey kisses up to Larry, oh, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, Larry. And you're sitting there going, what the heck am I watching? Anyway, it's very strange. So that's a recommendation if you want to laugh.
All right. Yeah, I mean, if we talked about all his relationships and his wives and everything, I think, again, that's probably another podcast. But yeah, it's interesting, again, just playing amateur psychologist. Again, he's searching for this Ermi, this governess. He kind of says that, he's sort of searching for a mixture of Ermi and his mother. And, I could see that. Did Ermi ever get back in touch with him, this governess? Do we know that?
I never heard anything about that. I don't know what ever became of this woman who was a fixture in his imagination for the rest of his life. I have no idea.
Yeah, because she went off at 18 and got married or got a boyfriend or something and left. And again, he felt abandoned. Not that he sort of held it against her, but I'm not sure I buy everything in this book, Songs My Mother Taught Me. I think it's fairly sincere, but it's kind of like when he testified at the trial of his son.
Yeah.
I hate to be cynical, but I do have to agree it looks a bit like a performance.
Yes.
And I'm not saying it is, and and I can't imagine that kind of pain, plus Cheyenne, of course, killed herself in Tahiti. And again, the fact that it happened in Tahiti, in this apparent paradise, that must have made it even more sort of heartbreaking,
Didn't he shortly leave? And he was primarily based in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills after that, last few years?
I think he just couldn't be around there anymore for obvious reasons. But is the house that he was in until he died, was that the same house that he apparently showed Edward R. Murrow? Did he have that house all those years? Do you know?
Oh, I doubt it. I'm still not even sure if that first house.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Did he have that set for the next 55 years? I was going to say. Yeah, there's loads of interesting adventures in the book about what happened in that house, and I can't even imagine really. But all right, so we are kind of coming to the end. Now, you wanted to mention Wally Cox, because another thing from the book, Brando seems in one sense, again, a bit like John Lennon, quite an unsociable person in one sense, that I think people sort of exasperated him. But then he makes quite a big thing of the fact that he had a lot of close friends and maintained friendships apparently for decades. So do you think Wally Cox was non-romantically the love of his life.
Yeah, it's a funny thing because much like Lennon, there's always these little hints or innuendos of something else going on. I can't speculate really on the extent of Brando's and Wally Cox's relationship, compare it to Lennon and Stu Sutcliffe, but they met in school and formed a close friendship because they were both intellectuals really in school. And then later on, when they sort of reunited in New York, Wally Cox, I think, found fame first because he had a television program called Mr. Peepers.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
Right. For the audience that might not know, Wally Cox was probably the prototypical nerd, a sort of very weedy-looking guy with glasses. Maybe his English equivalent would be Charles Hawtrey. So they made for an odd couple, that's for sure. Brando running around and hanging out with Wally Cox. You wouldn't expect them together. And I know that Brando said that was one of the great tragedies of his life. This is before later tragedies, I'm sure, overshadowed it, but that Wally left him so soon because Wally Cox died in the 70s. And Brando said that, that was a real heartbreak for him. The story that I have regarding this is a friend of mine, Will Hutchins, who's an actor who worked with Elvis in 2 movies and had a TV show. He was buddies with Betsy Palmer, and Betsy Palmer was an actress. Also, she was a game show panelist on a program called I've Got a Secret, and she might have been a Miss America runner-up or something like that. But she was friendly with both Brando and Wally Cox in New York, and they volunteered, both of them, to paint her apartment. And they came over with paint and ladders and drop cloths, and they took everything down off the walls, and they moved furniture around and covered it, and then they never returned. So that's the story.
Wow. I was waiting for something else.
Right, I know.
And the punchline, nothing happened.
The punchline is nothing happened.
Yeah. I was just going to say about Brando as a friend, I have this funny feeling with these extreme characters. If he trusted you, I feel like he might have been like a really, really nice friend, or like a very generous John Lennon again. When John Lennon trusted you, everyone has said, apart from Albert Goldman, but there's so much testimony that said he was generous, he'd give you the shirt off his back, proverbially speaking.
Right.
Do you feel like that maybe with Marlon Brando? Quite a giving guy, some good qualities.
I mean, I would think. The funny thing is, apart from Wally Cox, I don't know who Brando's close friends were.
I mean, he name checks a few in this book. I mean, I wouldn't know their names. I think maybe Maureen Stapleton, something.
Oh, right.
You know who that is? I think he name
yes.
checks a few people. And then I think he kept in touch with his sisters. And I think his sisters, I didn't realize they'd both become alcoholics as well, which is both ironic and not surprising at the same time.
Yeah, considering the parents.
Yeah. But I think they spent a lot of time reflecting, and they'd send letters to each other, which is quite touching, all trying to make sense of their childhoods, basically.
I don't think Brando had like Hollywood pals or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a question for you, actually. In the book, he makes a thing of the fact that him and Montgomery Clift were really good friends. Okay. And I guess you've seen that sort of home video of them and Kevin McCarthy doing this little skit, which I loved, yeah. But then in this Somebody biography, they kind of make out they weren't really friends and that they were more rivals. So have you got anything you could tell us about that?
I don't know. I mean, they seem like they're having a good old time in that home movie footage. I could see where they would be rivals because they were both, the new faces of the American male in Hollywood, right around the same time. I don't know. Yeah. Clift was praised for his acting and seen as bringing a new style to Hollywood. I don't quite see it, though. I see him more as maybe a leading man who has a vulnerability that we don't often see from leading men. Like you wouldn't see it really from Cary Grant or something like that. I don't see him as much competition for Brando, but they appear to be buddies in that. I'm more interested in Kevin McCarthy hanging around there because, he went on, it was Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Yeah. He had a long career doing other things, but yeah.
Well, I think from what he said on this documentary I watched, I think it was that TCM one. I sort of skimmed through it the other night. I think Kevin McCarthy was a bit older. He was married, so had a stable life. He was maybe no threat to Marlon. But I mean, as you said, I'm pretty sure he hated Frank Sinatra. Well, they mutually. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know Paul Newman. Paul Newman was involved in some kind of activism, I think.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, he was.
So perhaps they would have known each other, but I think maybe just, young guys, a rivalry.
Well, it's funny. Paul Newman, we talked about people that were pegged to be next Brando, and I forget about Newman, but he certainly was at that time. But
they were almost the same age, weren't they?
Yeah, but he came on a little later.
Oh, right. Yeah, I suppose the Hustlers.
Yeah.
Well, what did he do before then?
Well, Cool Hand Luke is the 60s.
Yeah, so Brando was already established, wasn't he? Yeah. All right. Do you mind if we do a wrap-up?
Yeah, let's do it.
This has been amazing. It's fantastic. Thanks so much. Again, we've done 2 collaborations in the last 2 weeks. It's been fabulous.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about, I think the legacy is clear. I mean, at the end of this biography, the Somebody one, they talk about almost the last paragraph, despite all the tragedies that happened to him, his legacy, Twitter aside, I think his legacy, you can see it in all these actors. But what did he bring that's perhaps unique to him or to a chosen few? What do you reckon?
Well, I think I said at the start of this, I mean, there had been quote-unquote method actors in Hollywood before, and John Garfield was the big one before Brando. But Brando just sort of coincided. It's a happy accident in a way. It was the end of the studio system. So you have movies that are attempting to branch out and do something different in one sense to compete with television, but at the same time, there is a kind of activism in the films and a sense that we are now making art. I mean, this idea really takes hold in the 1950s, and Brando comes along at just the right time to be the vehicle for that. And, then you've got Kazan adapting Tennessee Williams, and you've got these quote-unquote important films like On the Waterfront, message movies as they were called at the time. And Brando is the embodiment of that movement, more so than a Montgomery Clift or anybody else who came along around that same time. It's a cliche, but that sort of brooding, intellectual, vulnerable, masculine figure, that alpha male, that is not a buffoon, that there's more going on. He can be a vessel for all sorts of stories,
I think it's a mix, actually. I was thinking about this after we spoke last time. I think it's a mix of masculine and feminine.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe, one of the reasons that he was so popular with the ladies, because I had a friend actually in Madrid who was kind of similar, because he did martial arts and he was quite muscular, but then he would show his emotions. So I think the thing that entrances us is that mix of masculine and feminine.
I mean, who would be the masculine figures in the movies before that? I mean, John Wayne.
I mean, someone like Clark Gable. I mean, I just never, or Bogart, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, Bogart. But I mean, it's clear, even if we can't quite put it into words, it's clear that Brando's cut from a different cloth than from those guys.
Yeah, I think just perhaps Streetcar is really the embodiment. I mean, I know you like it On the Waterfront a bit more than I do. I still really like it. I think we both agreed perhaps Streetcar of the early career is all the Brando magic in one film almost.
Yeah, there's a reason it's number one.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. All right. And then recommended books. So we said, the memoir, Songs of Mother Taught Me. The Somebody one's not bad. What other ones?
I mean, I'd mentioned the Conversations with Brando just because I really like long-form interviews. The other ones I read were mainly films of books where they just talk about each film in chronological order and, more like reference books than sitting down and reading. So I'm deficient in that category. I mean, I'm reading this one now, and maybe I'll tackle the Peter Manson book. It's like the tune-in of Marlon Brando fandom.
Yeah. Not sure if Mark Lewison would like that comparison.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Manso's it's pretty trashy, but it's quite entertaining. I mean, you'll zip through it. I mean, I haven't read it for years, to be honest, but I remember thinking if you detach it from the truth, there's probably a bit of truth in it, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's the tabloid Brando, really. Yeah. And then documentaries is Meet Marlon Brando, as we said earlier, fantastic. And then Listen to Me, Marlon. There's a couple of others. What you mentioned, the one from 1981. Is that just called Brando or something like that?
I think it is. Yeah, that's the one where they interview his sister, Jocelyn Brando's in it quite a bit. And they don't have much footage per se. They show a lot of still photographs from movies and there's talking heads. And it's interesting. Carl Malden's in it, being interviewed at length. And I don't even know what it was for. I want to say that it might actually be a BBC program that was released here. What was the show? Was it like Omnibus or something like that? That would do these specials, these documentaries? Yeah.
Yeah, Arena or Omnibus. Probably.
Arena, yeah. Right, something like that.
And then there's a TCM one, which is actually about 2.5 hours. And it's not bad. So lots of people waxing lyrical about him, which is fine.
Right.
And then there's one called Marlon Brando, The Wild One. Again, lots of waxing lyrical, but Anthony Hopkins is in that doing an analysis. Oh. Pretty good. And then stuff's popping up all the time, isn't it, really? Snippets of interviews. Sure, they'll keep coming, won't they?
Yeah. He did quite a bit. It's just, that Studs Terkel, I don't even know how old or how long that's been on YouTube, but it's fairly recent. And the Carson one is fairly recent.
Yeah, that's a good clip. And then Cavett, as we said, Connie Chung, Larry King, I suppose, and then Sullivan and Morrow just for the surreal.
I really do feel that everyone would be better served by watching Listen to Me, Marlon. I feel like that really gives us a better sense of who he is more than anything else. I personally.
I guess there'll be people listening who would know his films, but maybe not know that much about him. I always feel like to give the person a fair shake, you should get their side of the story first. Because otherwise, if you get the more tabloidy one, then it seems like they're defending themselves or rewriting history. Right. If you start with their version, then I think that's the fair way of approaching it, really. So.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone, for listening. And, I'll get this out at some point. A lot of editing to do, but it'll be worth it. I generally keep most of it in,
Right.
I've had an affliction to ers and ums, that's all. I call it OCD editing.
My thing is, I keep saying, all the time, and it drives me crazy. So when
you don't say like.
I don't say like a lot, yeah. And considering I'm such like a fan of beatniks, and I just used it right there, I should be saying like all the time. Hey man, like wow, but I never do.
All right.
I say the dreaded, like McCartney, which makes his interviews excruciating.
John was a great guy,
Yeah.
That kind
I just listened to one the other day from 1966. Pop Profiles, and it's like, I go to these, these electronic shows, and I like to hear a bit of Stockhausen, and you're like, oh man, just shut up with your nose. Oh.
So the big question after 3 hours: what have you got to sell? Go on, sell us something.
Oh, I don't.
You don't have any movies coming out.
Yeah, I got nothing. Yeah, I'd rather people just watch, Listen to Me, Marlon, and take a look at those movies. Yeah,
yeah, we've done this podcast for all the right reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just stay on the line for a second. Sure. Thanks again, as ever, and I'm sure we'll meet again. Da, da, da.
Don't know where, don't know when.
All right, thanks very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
In the short Penguin Lives book, Brando, Patricia Bosworth reports that late in life, Marlon confided to a friend that he had spent a lifetime trying to be less crazy. In that admission lies the key to all that came before. If there was a rosebud in Brando's life, it was the mental illness that had dogged him for decades, probably from early childhood. So many of the actions he took were not those of a rational man, and the wonder, in the end, is not that he made so few essential films, but that he made so many. He knew as much. The only book he published in his lifetime, Brando, Songs My Mother Taught Me, was dedicated to his sisters, his children, and his psychiatrist. Concluded Marlon, thanks to Dr. Harrington, my own efforts, and the simple passage of time, I can finally be the child I never had a chance to be. In the competition with his great rival Montgomery Clift, he seems to have won the self-destruction contest. Clift's may not have been the longest suicide in Hollywood after all. Occasions of sanity and sanctity were not unfamiliar to Marlon, but he found them very late in life. Meditating in solitude, reading philosophy, speaking to strangers on ham radio, lying out on the sand under the stars, attempting, however inexpertly, to speak up for those who had done wrong or who had been wronged. He had spent a lot of time in both camps. Even in death, Marlon could not stay out of the tabloids. Christian Brando got into more trouble when actor Robert Blake was accused of murdering his wife, Bonnie Lee Backley, Blake, in turn, accused Christian, who had been romantically involved with Bonnie, and who Blake believed was the father of her year-old daughter. DNA tests proved otherwise. Blake was the father. Moreover, police determined that Christian's alibi was sound. He happened to be out of state on the night of the shooting. When Blake was acquitted, Christian's name receded from the headlines, only to surface one more time at his death in January 2008. He had died, said one of his friends, from too much living. Marlon's name never did leave the newspapers for long. Frequently it was in the show business pages, and once in the real estate section when Jack Nicholson bought Marlon's house for $5 million. The place, he remarked sadly, was derelict, and getting the mold out would be difficult. It is more than likely that we'll take the house down. Marlon's estate has long since been evaluated, fought over, and dispersed. But he left two bequests that lie beyond the reach of his heirs and assigns. The first is to the public. 5 of his early films are indisputable classics of black and white cinema. The Men, A Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, Julius Caesar, and On the Waterfront. The Wild One has made its own place in popular culture. Between those astonishing features and The Godfather, there is widely and incorrectly supposed to be a desert with only a handful of oases. Marlon took a lot of significant roles between his debut as Ken Wilczek in 1950 and the Vito Corleone of 1972. Sky Masterson, Major Groover, Snakeskin Xavier, Rio, Fletcher Christian, Robert Crane, Major Weldon Penderton, Sir William Walker, and Peter Quint are memorable figures that no one else could have played with such convincing passion. Post-Godfather came such indelible persona as Paul of Last Tango, Robert E. Lee Clayton of the Missouri Breaks, Colonel Walter E. Kurtz of Apocalypse Now, and Ian McKenzie of A Dry White Season. These creations have aged well, even if the motion pictures themselves show the erosions of time. The second bequest is to the acting community. John Saxon recalls the first time he saw Brando. The Oscars had recently been given out for Waterfront, and Marlon was a bit wary as he parked near Schwab's drugstore on Sunset Boulevard, a famous hangout for showfolk. He had reason to smile a minute later. The 30-year-old emerged from his car, says Saxon, and I remember an actor saying, "Marlon, you did it for us." These were not the Tyrone Power kind of good-looking people. You did it for us meant you gave us an opportunity to be somebody. It was a break in the system. As things turned out, it was more than a break. It was a complete severance. The opportunity to be somebody, in Saxon's phrase, mirrored Terry Malloy's famous protest in On the Waterfront. I could have had class. I could have been somebody. By taking chances, by jumping without a net in film after film for more than 50 years, Marlon Brando rewrote the conventions of screen acting. In the process, he helped to make somebodies out of performers who, in previous times, would have settled for character parts, if they worked at all. There can be no doubt of James Caan's observation, made after his hero had passed away. Anyone of my generation who says he hasn't done Brando is lying. Will Marlon retain his iconic status in the years to come? The collective memory is short, and in the epoch of the 24-hour news cycle, the iPod, YouTube, TiVo, and video games, there are more distractions than ever before. Yet, in a crowning irony, there are also unprecedented devices for information retrieval. Today, the Brando oeuvre can be fetched by hitting a few computer keys. Skeptics who think the man's impact is exaggerated can find the truth easily enough. All they have to do is compare the leading male performances before his debut with those afterward. Once observed, these astonishing performances cannot be unseen. The bud who blossomed into a superstar, the champion who called himself a bum, the artist who denied his art, remains a dominant presence in contemporary cinema. Another generation has taken over from Caan's, and its members are still doing Brando. The generations that follow are likely to be doing him for the rest of this century and beyond.